I thought I was walking into just another chaotic Thanksgiving dinner when I pulled up to my childhood home carrying the pumpkin bread I'd spent all morning perfecting with Dad's recipe. Instead, my Uncle Dennis blocked the front doorway like a bouncer. His face twisted with disgust as he declared I wasn't family anymore and needed to leave immediately. Behind him, my mother Sarah's cruel laughter echoed from the dining room as she cheerfully handed my usual seat to my sister Emma's boyfriend Tyler, some guy she'd been dating for maybe 8 weeks. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but I just nodded quietly, walked back to my car with my heart pounding, and sent the text message I'd been holding on to for 3 long months. Within 5 minutes, half the dinner table was empty as relatives stormed out the front door. Let me back up and explain how we got to this nightmare. I'm Rosa, 28 years old, and I work as a marketing coordinator in downtown Chicago. For my entire life, I'd been the family glue, the one who organized holiday gatherings, remembered everyone's birthdays, and smoothed over arguments between relatives. When my father died of cancer 2 years ago, our family dynamics shifted like tectonic plates. Mom struggled with grief and loneliness, which I completely understood. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly she'd fall for Uncle Dennis, my father's younger brother, who swooped in with flowers and sympathy casseroles just weeks after the funeral. Their courtship felt rushed and uncomfortable, but I tried to be supportive. Mom deserved companionship after 30 years of marriage to my father. Dennis had always been the charming, jovial uncle at family barbecues, cracking jokes and bringing expensive wine. When they announced their engagement 6 months after Dad's death, several relatives raised eyebrows, but I encouraged everyone to respect Mom's choices. When they married 8 months ago in a small ceremony at the local courthouse, I stood as Mom's witness and smiled for all the photos. But something felt wrong almost immediately. Dennis moved into our family home, the house where I'd grown up, and began making changes. New furniture appeared, expensive electronics, a fancy sound system for the living room. When I asked Mom about the sudden spending spree, she waved off my concerns, saying Dennis was just making the place more comfortable for both of them. She seemed genuinely happy for the first time since losing Dad, so I swallowed my unease and tried to focus on my own life. My sister Emma, 25, and working part-time at a trendy boutique downtown, still lived at home and seemed to enjoy the upgraded lifestyle. She got along well with Dennis, who treated her like a beloved niece, buying her designer handbags and paying for spa weekends with her girlfriends. Emma thought I was being paranoid when I mentioned feeling uncomfortable about the expensive gifts and sudden wealth. The first real red flag came when I tried to access some of Dad's financial records for tax purposes. As his eldest daughter and the one who'd helped him manage his investments before he got sick, I expected to have continued access to the family accountant. Instead, I discovered that Dennis had quietly taken over all financial responsibilities and changed passwords on every account. When I asked Mom about it, she said Dennis was just trying to protect her from the stress of money management during her grief. That's when I decided to do some investigating on my own. I hired a forensic accountant using my own savings, a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. What she uncovered over the next 2 months made my stomach turn. Dennis had systematically transferred $47,000 from my father's accounts into his personal checking account, starting just 2 weeks after the funeral. The money had funded their honeymoon to Europe, the new furniture, expensive jewelry for Mom, and a shiny new pickup truck that Dennis claimed was a gift from his previous employer. But the financial theft was just the beginning. I discovered forged signatures on transfer documents, fake power of attorney papers that Dennis had somehow convinced Mom to sign, and evidence that he'd been intercepting mail addressed to our family. The forensic accountant found patterns suggesting Dennis had done this before, possibly to other grieving families in different states. For 3 months, I gathered evidence while pretending everything was normal during family dinners and holiday visits. I documented every suspicious transaction, photographed papers when Mom wasn't looking, and built a timeline of Dennis's manipulation. The hardest part was watching Mom defend him whenever I asked innocent questions about their finances. She'd grown defensive and protective of Dennis, almost aggressive toward anyone who questioned their relationship. The night before Thanksgiving, I'd spent hours perfecting Dad's pumpkin bread recipe, the one he'd made every year since I was little. I dressed carefully in the blue cashmere sweater Dad had given me for my last birthday, the one he said brought out my eyes. I coordinated with my cousins about who was bringing what dishes, received warm text messages from family members, excited about seeing everyone, and tried to push down the growing dread in my chest about what I might have to do. When I pulled into the driveway that Thursday morning, I noticed Dennis wearing an expensive new watch I'd never seen before. His hostile greeting caught me completely off guard because he'd been perfectly friendly during our last phone conversation 3 days earlier. The cruelty in his voice as he told me I wasn't welcome anymore felt like being slapped. But what really broke my heart was seeing my mother's face behind him, laughing as she gestured Tyler toward the dining room chair where I'd sat for every family gathering since childhood. Tyler looked mortified by the entire situation. He'd only been dating Emma for 2 months, and being thrust into this family drama clearly made him uncomfortable. Emma stood behind Mom looking confused, but not defending me, which stung almost as much as the initial rejection. I walked back to my car on shaking legs, placed Dad's pumpkin bread carefully on the passenger seat, and pulled out my phone. The message I sent was simple, but devastating. Marcus, check your email. Sent the estate audit to everyone 20 minutes ago. Uncle Dennis has been stealing from Dad's accounts. My cousin Marcus was Dad's nephew, a lawyer who'd grown up spending summers at our house. He'd been suspicious of Dennis from the beginning, but hadn't said anything out of respect for Mom's grieving process. I knew he'd take the evidence seriously and act quickly. Within 2 minutes, my phone started buzzing with incoming calls from relatives. Through the living room window, I could see Dennis's face change from smug satisfaction to growing alarm as family members began checking their phones simultaneously. Aunt Patricia, Dad's sister, stood up so abruptly that her chair fell over. She pointed an accusatory finger at Dennis while shouting something I couldn't hear through the glass. Uncle Robert, Marcus's father, headed straight for the front door with his wife close behind. Then cousin Marcus himself burst through the door, followed by 2 more relatives I hadn't expected to react so quickly. The Thanksgiving dinner I'd been excluded from was falling apart in real time, exactly as I'd hoped it would when I finally found the courage to expose Dennis for the fraud he really was. Watching the family implode through the windshield of my Honda felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. The forensic accounting report I'd sent to 15 family members contained bank statements, forged signature comparisons, and a detailed timeline of financial theft that painted Dennis as a calculating predator who targeted our family during our most vulnerable moment. The evidence was overwhelming. Dennis had forged Dad's signature on multiple transfer documents, moving money from investment accounts into checking accounts he controlled. He'd convinced Mom to sign power of attorney papers by telling her they were routine insurance forms related to Dad's death. The new furniture, the European honeymoon, the expensive gifts he'd showered on Mom and Emma, even the fancy steakhouse dinners he'd insisted on paying for during their courtship had all been funded with stolen inheritance money. But what made the theft even more disgusting was the psychological manipulation Dennis had used to cover his tracks. He'd spent months convincing Mom that I was being greedy and suspicious about money, planting seeds of doubt about my motives whenever I asked questions about the estate. He'd positioned himself as the protective husband, shielding her from a grasping daughter who couldn't accept her mother's happiness. Through my car window, I watched Aunt Patricia march back into the house, probably to confront Dennis directly. She'd been Dad's favorite sister, a retired school principal who didn't tolerate lies or manipulation. Uncle Robert followed her, his face red with anger that I could see even from 50 feet away. Marcus stood on the front porch talking rapidly into his phone, probably calling his law firm's partners for advice on handling a family fraud case. My phone rang constantly as more relatives read the evidence and reacted with shock and fury. Cousin Jennifer, who lived 3 states away, left a voicemail saying she'd suspected something was wrong when Dennis had asked her strange questions about Dad's life insurance policies at the funeral. Great Aunt Helen, Dad's 78-year-old aunt, called crying because she'd lent Dennis $5,000 last month that now seemed connected to his systematic theft. The hardest call came from my grandmother, Dad's mother, who lived in a retirement community about an hour away. She'd been too frail to attend Thanksgiving dinner this year, but someone had forwarded her the evidence report. "Rosa, honey," she said in her shaky voice, "I'm so sorry I didn't see this coming. Your father warned me about Dennis years ago, said there was something dishonest about him, but I thought family loyalty meant giving people the benefit of the doubt." Emma finally emerged from the house looking lost and confused as she approached my car. She knocked on the passenger window and I rolled it down to hear her stammering apology. "Rosa, I had no idea what was happening. Mom said you were being difficult about money and couldn't accept her moving on with Dennis. I thought maybe you were jealous or something, but this evidence you sent everyone, is it really true?" Before I could answer, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Rosa Martinez," a professional woman's voice asked. "This is Detective Williams with the Fraud Division. We received a report from a forensic accountant about potential financial elder abuse involving your family. I need you to come down to the station as soon as possible to discuss the evidence you've gathered." My heart started racing as the reality hit me. This wasn't just family drama anymore. The forensic accountant had done exactly what she'd warned me she might have to do when we first met, report suspected financial crimes to law enforcement. Dennis wasn't just going to face family consequences for his theft. He was about to face criminal charges. As Detective Williams explained the next steps over the phone, I watched police cars pull into our neighborhood. 2 patrol vehicles parked across the street from Mom's house, their presence immediately noticed by curious neighbors who began peering through curtains and gathering on front porches. The quiet suburban Thanksgiving was about to become a very public spectacle. Emma backed away from my car as she saw the police approaching her, face pale with realization that this situation was far more serious than a family argument about money. Through the living room window, I could see Dennis's panicked expression as he noticed the patrol cars. Mom stood beside him, still apparently unaware of how dramatically her world was about to change. Marcus walked over to my car, leaning down to speak through the window. "Rosa, the evidence you gathered is incredibly thorough. Dennis is about to be arrested, and Mom is going to need support, even though she's been defending him. Are you prepared for how ugly this is going to get?" I nodded, thinking about Dad's moral lessons throughout my childhood, about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. He'd taught me that family loyalty meant protecting family members from harm, not enabling people to cause that harm. Dennis had violated our family's trust in the worst possible way, and exposing him wasn't cruel revenge, but necessary justice. The police officers approached the front door just as Detective Williams finished explaining that I needed to come to the station immediately to provide my evidence and formal statement. This was no longer about a ruined Thanksgiving dinner. This was about preventing Dennis from destroying any more families the way he'd tried to destroy ours. As I started my car to drive to the police station, I realized that the message I'd sent 20 minutes ago hadn't just changed our holiday plans. It had changed everything. Detective Williams turned out to be a patient woman in her 40s who specialized in financial crimes against elderly and vulnerable adults. At the police station, she spread my evidence across a conference table and explained that what Dennis had done constituted several serious felonies, including forged signatures, fraudulent transfers, and financial elder abuse. The forensic accountant had done excellent work documenting the paper trail, making the case against Dennis surprisingly straightforward from a legal perspective. What makes this particularly serious, Detective Williams explained, is the timing and the victim targeting. Your uncle specifically chose to exploit your family during the grieving process when your mother was most vulnerable to manipulation. That's a pattern we see with professional financial predators. Professional predators. The phrase made my stomach turn as I realized Dennis hadn't stumbled into this theft opportunity. He'd planned it carefully, probably from the moment Dad got sick. While I'd been focused on helping care for our dying father, Dennis had been calculating how to profit from the upcoming tragedy. The detective's investigation revealed that Dennis had a history I'd never known about. He'd been married twice before, both times to widows with substantial assets. His first wife in Arizona had lost her entire retirement savings before she figured out what was happening and divorced him. His second wife in Nevada had been less fortunate, losing both her savings and her house before Dennis disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving her bankrupt and homeless. We've been tracking him for 2 years, Detective Williams continued, ever since his second wife filed a report. We suspect there may be other victims in other states who never reported the crimes because they were too embarrassed or didn't realize that family financial abuse is a prosecutable offense. The scope of Dennis's criminal career shocked me. This wasn't an impulsive decision to steal from our family. This was his business model, targeting grieving women and systematically draining their resources before moving on to the next victim. My mother had been marked as prey before she even knew she was being hunted. When I finally returned home that evening, I found 17 missed calls from family members and 3 voicemail messages from local news stations who'd somehow gotten wind of the story. The image of police cars in our quiet neighborhood had apparently attracted attention from reporters looking for human interest stories about holiday family drama. Emma was waiting in my apartment building lobby when I got home, her eyes red from crying. Rosa, I need to tell you something about Dennis that I should have mentioned months ago. He's been opening my mail, reading my bank statements and credit card bills. I thought it was weird, but Mom said he was just trying to help with household organization after Dad died. This revelation added another layer to Dennis's manipulation strategy. He'd been monitoring the entire family's financial information, probably looking for additional accounts to target or weaknesses to exploit. Emma had been naive to accept his explanations, but she'd also been grieving her father and trusting a family member who seemed to genuinely care about her welfare. There's something else, Emma continued. That college fund Dad set up for me when I was little, Dennis told me it had been depleted by Dad's medical expenses and funeral costs. But yesterday, I called the bank directly, and they said the money was transferred to an account I'd never heard of just 3 weeks ago. My hands started shaking as I realized Dennis had stolen from Emma too, not just from Dad's estate and Mom's accounts. He'd taken money specifically designated for her education and future money Dad had worked overtime shifts to contribute to throughout Emma's childhood. The cruelty of stealing a dead man's gift to his daughter felt even more personal than the broader estate theft. That night I couldn't sleep as I processed the full magnitude of what Dennis had done to our family. He hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen our ability to trust each other, our sense of security, and our faith in family bonds. Mom had been manipulated into betraying her own daughters in defense of her abuser. Emma had been gaslighted into accepting invasive monitoring and financial theft. I'd been painted as the villain for asking reasonable questions about suspicious behavior. The psychological damage Dennis had inflicted might take years to repair even after the financial crimes were prosecuted. He'd weaponized Mom's grief and loneliness, turning her into an accomplice in his theft from her own family. The guilt and shame she'd feel when she finally understood what had been done in her name would be devastating. Around 3 a.m, Detective Williams called with an urgent update. "Rosa, we need to accelerate this investigation. We just discovered that Dennis has been making preparations to leave the state, possibly the country. He's liquidated several accounts today and booked a flight to Mexico for tomorrow morning. We're going to arrest him tonight before he can flee." The news that Dennis had been planning to abandon Mom and disappear with stolen money hit me like a physical blow. She genuinely believed he loved her, that their marriage represented a second chance at happiness after losing Dad. Learning that Dennis had been preparing to vanish with her money would destroy her emotionally, but it might also help her understand the depth of his deception. Within an hour, Detective Williams called again to confirm that Dennis had been arrested at his friend's house, where he'd been hiding out since the family confrontation earlier that day. They'd found cash fake identification documents and evidence that he'd been planning this escape route for weeks, probably since he first realized I was asking too many questions about the family finances. The arrest made everything feel suddenly real and final. There would be no family reconciliation with Dennis, no explanation that might somehow excuse his behavior, no possibility that this had all been a misunderstanding. He was a criminal who'd targeted our family with deliberate, calculated cruelty, and now he'd face the legal consequences for his choices. But I also knew the hardest part was just beginning. Mom would have to confront the reality that her new husband had been systematically betraying her from their very first meeting. Emma would have to accept that her comfortable lifestyle over the past year had been funded by theft from her own family, and I would have to find a way to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by months of manipulation and lies, while also helping my family heal from the trauma of being victimized by someone we'd trusted completely. The media attention started small, but grew quickly once reporters understood the full scope of Dennis's crimes. A local television station ran a story about Thanksgiving Day fraud arrest that focused on the dramatic timing of his exposure during a family holiday. Within days, the story was picked up by regional news outlets, then national websites that specialized in financial crime reporting. I found myself thrust into an unexpected role as a spokesperson for financial elder abuse awareness. Detective Williams suggested that speaking publicly about our experience might help other families recognize similar warning signs and encourage victims to report crimes they might otherwise keep secret out of embarrassment or misplaced loyalty. The court proceedings began quickly. Dennis hired an expensive defense attorney using money he'd stolen from our family, which felt like the final insult added to all the previous injuries. His lawyer tried to argue that the financial transfers had been legitimate gifts from a grieving widow to her new husband, authorized by power of attorney documents that Mom had willingly signed. But the evidence against Dennis was overwhelming. The forensic accountant had documented not just the forged signatures and fraudulent transfers, but also the pattern of manipulation he'd used to gain access to family financial information. Text messages on his phone revealed conversations with criminal associates in other states, discussing techniques for targeting vulnerable widows and strategies for avoiding prosecution. Mom's testimony at the grand jury hearing was heartbreaking to witness. She had to admit publicly that she'd been manipulated into betraying her own daughters, that her judgment had been compromised by grief and loneliness, and that she'd defended Dennis against reasonable suspicions from family members who'd been trying to protect her. I wanted so desperately to believe that someone could love me after losing my husband. She said through tears that I ignored obvious warning signs and dismissed my daughter's concerns. I chose the fantasy of being cherished over the responsibility of protecting my family. Emma also testified about Dennis's invasive monitoring of her personal finances and his theft of her college fund. Her testimony was particularly effective because she could describe how Dennis had gradually normalized inappropriate behavior, making his violations seem like care and concern rather than criminal surveillance. The community response to our story was surprisingly supportive. Neighbors who'd seemed judgmental about the police cars and news crews began approaching me with their own stories of elderly relatives who'd been victimized by romance scams or financial exploitation. Our local bank implemented new policies requiring additional verification for large transfers from accounts belonging to recent widows or widowers. But the family healing process was complicated and painful. Mom struggled with shame about her role in enabling Dennis's crimes, alternating between defensive anger and desperate apologies. Some days she seemed to understand the magnitude of what had happened, while other days she retreated into denial and blamed external circumstances for the family conflict. Emma threw herself into researching financial abuse prevention, attending support groups for fraud victims, and learning about the psychological techniques Dennis had used to manipulate our family. Her transformation from naive victim to informed advocate happened quickly, driven by guilt about her previous dismissal of my concerns and determination to rebuild our sisterly relationship. Grandmother Helen, despite being Dennis's oldest victim, became our strongest family supporter. She publicly defended my decision to expose the crimes, even when other relatives suggested I should have handled the situation more privately to avoid embarrassing Mom. "Rosa did what my son would have wanted her to do," she told anyone who questioned my methods. "She protected the family from a predator." The investigation revealed that Dennis had been running similar schemes in 3 other states under different aliases. FBI agents contacted me to discuss his pattern of targeting grieving families and asked for my help in building cases against him for federal crimes. My courage in speaking up had apparently prevented him from victimizing dozens more families who were already on his target list. Dennis's sentencing hearing was scheduled for just before Christmas, which felt somehow appropriate, given how he'd tried to destroy our holiday traditions. The judge would consider not just the crimes against our family, but also his extensive criminal history and the broader pattern of targeting vulnerable victims across multiple states. In the weeks leading up to sentencing, I received dozens of letters from other families who'd been victimized by Dennis or similar financial predators. Many of them thanked me for speaking publicly about our experience because it had given them courage to report their own cases or seek help for elderly relatives who were being exploited. One letter particularly moved me from an 82-year-old woman in Oregon whose late husband's brother had stolen her entire retirement savings, using tactics identical to Dennis's approach with our family. "Reading about your situation helped me understand that I wasn't stupid or gullible," she wrote. "I was grieving and vulnerable, and someone I trusted chose to exploit that vulnerability instead of protecting me." The broader impact of our story extended beyond individual cases. State legislators began drafting new laws to strengthen penalties for financial crimes against elderly victims and require additional oversight for large financial transfers during probate proceedings. banking industry representatives contacted me about developing training materials to help employees recognize potential financial abuse situations. But the most meaningful change was happening within our own family. Emma and I had grown closer than we'd been since childhood, bonded by shared trauma and mutual commitment to protecting Mom from future exploitation. She'd moved out of the family home and into her own apartment, establishing healthy independence while maintaining regular contact with Mom and me. Mom was attending therapy to process her grief, shame, and anger about Dennis's betrayal. The work was difficult and sometimes seemed to make her more depressed rather than better, but she was beginning to accept responsibility for her choices and understand how her desperation for companionship had made her vulnerable to manipulation. Christmas Eve brought an unexpected gift. Detective Williams called to inform me that Dennis had decided to plead guilty to all charges rather than face a lengthy federal trial. He'd accepted an 8-year prison sentence and agreed to pay full restitution to all victims. The plea deal meant we wouldn't have to endure months of trial proceedings that would keep the trauma fresh and painful. But more importantly, Dennis's guilty plea validated everything I'd done to expose him. There would be no more questions about whether I'd overreacted or misunderstood innocent behavior. He was admitting publicly that he deliberately victimized our family and many others, that his theft had been calculated and intentional, rather than impulsive or accidental. The money would be recovered and returned to all victims, though the emotional damage would take much longer to heal. Emma's college fund would be restored. Grandmother Helen would get back her life savings, and Mom would have the financial security Dad had worked so hard to provide for her future. But the greatest victory was the knowledge that Dennis would never be able to target another grieving family. His guilty plea would follow him for the rest of his life, making it impossible for him to gain the trust necessary to commit these crimes again. The day before Dennis's sentencing, his defense attorney delivered a sealed envelope to my apartment building. Inside was a letter Dennis had written from jail, apparently hoping to influence my victim impact statement to the court. Reading his words felt like encountering a completely different person from the charming uncle who'd brought wine to family barbecues. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation, alternating between false remorse and subtle threats. Dennis claimed he'd never intended to hurt our family, that financial pressures from his previous divorces had forced him into desperate actions. He suggested that exposing his crimes publicly had been unnecessarily cruel and vindictive, that family problems should have been resolved privately without involving law enforcement. But the most disturbing part of the letter was Dennis's attempt to minimize the psychological damage he'd inflicted. He wrote as if stealing money was his only crime, completely ignoring the way he'd turned family members against each other, manipulated Mom into betraying her daughters, and violated our sense of safety and trust within our own family relationships. I shared the letter with Detective Williams, who explained that such communications were common from financial predators facing sentencing. They often continued trying to manipulate victims even from jail, sometimes hoping to convince them to request lighter sentences or reduced restitution requirements. The sentencing hearing felt like the climax of a long, exhausting journey toward justice. I'd prepared a victim impact statement describing not just the financial theft, but the broader destruction Dennis had inflicted on our family relationships and emotional well-being. Emma and Mom also submitted statements, though Mom's was conflicted and sometimes seemed to partially excuse Dennis's behavior. Judge Patricia Hendricks had presided over numerous financial elder abuse cases and clearly understood the devastating impact such crimes have on families. She listened carefully to all the victim statements, reviewed the extensive evidence of Dennis's criminal pattern across multiple states, and considered his lack of genuine remorse for the psychological trauma he'd caused. Mr. Dennis Walsh," she said, using his real name rather than the alias he'd been using when he targeted our family. "You have systematically exploited the most vulnerable moment in multiple families' lives. You turned their grief into your opportunity, their love into your weapon, their trust into your tool for theft." The judge sentenced Dennis to 8 years in federal prison and ordered complete restitution to all victims, plus additional penalties for the emotional distress and legal costs his crimes had caused. She also prohibited him from contacting any victims or their families directly or through intermediaries, including any future attempts to manipulate our family members. But the most satisfying moment came when Judge Hendricks addressed the broader implications of Dennis's crimes. She ordered that his case file be shared with law enforcement agencies in all 50 states to help identify other potential victims and prevent similar crimes. Dennis's pattern of targeting grieving widows would become part of training materials for police detectives and banking industry fraud prevention specialists. In the weeks following sentencing, our family began the slow process of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by months of manipulation and betrayal. Mom was making genuine progress in therapy, learning to recognize the warning signs of manipulation and developing healthier boundaries in future relationships. I realize now that I was so afraid of being alone that I convinced myself Dennis's love was worth any price, she told Emma and me during one of our weekly family dinners. I chose the fantasy of being rescued over the reality of standing on my own strength, and that choice nearly destroyed my relationships with my daughters. Emma had enrolled in college financial management courses and was considering a career change into fraud prevention or victim advocacy. Her personal experience with Dennis's manipulation had given her insights into how financial predators operate and how families can protect themselves from similar schemes. The money recovery process took several months, but eventually all victims received full restitution plus interest for the time their funds had been stolen. Emma's college fund was restored completely, allowing her to return to school and complete her degree without the financial pressure she'd been facing before Dennis stole her education money. Grandmother Helen used part of her recovered savings to establish a small scholarship fund for students studying financial crimes. Investigation inspired by the forensic accountant, whose work had been crucial in exposing Dennis. She wanted to ensure other families would have access to the professional expertise needed to uncover complex financial fraud schemes. The most unexpected development came from my father's attorney, who contacted me 6 months after Dennis's sentencing with a sealed letter Dad had left specifically for this situation. He'd changed his will secretly during his final illness, apparently suspecting that Dennis might try to exploit the family after his death. The letter revealed that Dad had been quietly investigating Dennis's background before he died, concerned by inconsistencies in stories Dennis told about his previous marriages and employment history. Dad had discovered some of Dennis's criminal history and left detailed instructions for protecting the family assets if Dennis ever tried to access them inappropriately. Rosa. The letter read, "If you're reading this, then Dennis has shown his true nature, and you've been brave enough to expose him. I'm proud of you for protecting our family the way I couldn't finish doing before I died. Your integrity and courage are my greatest gifts to your mother and sister." Reading Dad's words felt like receiving his blessing for all the difficult decisions I'd made over the past year. He'd anticipated exactly what happened and had tried to prepare me for the responsibility of protecting our family from Dennis's predatory behavior. The letter also contained specific instructions for managing the family finances going forward, including recommendations for professional advisors and strategies for protecting Mom and Emma from future exploitation attempts. Dad had thought through every detail of keeping our family safe, even beyond his own lifetime. But perhaps the most meaningful discovery was a provision in Dad's will that I'd never known about. He'd established a trust fund specifically for family crisis situations, funded by a life insurance policy I'd never heard him mention. The trust provided resources for legal fees, investigation costs, and family support during exactly the kind of crisis Dennis had created. The insurance company explained that the policy had a special provision doubling the payout if the policyholder's family became victims of financial crimes. Dad had apparently purchased this specific protection after learning about Dennis's suspicious background, ensuring our family would have resources to fight back if necessary. This discovery meant we recovered not just the money Dennis had stolen, but additional resources to help other families in similar situations. The surplus funds allowed me to establish a nonprofit organization focused on financial abuse prevention and victim support, turning our painful experience into a resource for protecting other vulnerable families. 6 months after Dennis's sentencing, I received a call from Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's white-collar crime division. The case against Dennis had uncovered a broader criminal network of financial predators who specialized in targeting grieving families across the country. My willingness to speak publicly about our experience had encouraged dozens of other families to come forward with similar stories. "Rosa, we need your help with something unprecedented," Agent Chen explained. "Dennis's case has become the foundation for the largest financial elder abuse prosecution in federal history. We've identified at least 47 families across 12 states who were victimized by this network over the past 5 years. The scope of the criminal enterprise shocked me. Dennis hadn't been working alone, but as part of an organized group that shared information about potential targets' techniques for gaining trust and methods for laundering stolen money. They had a sophisticated operation that included forged document specialists, corrupt bank employees, and even fake references who would vouch for their character during courtship periods. My testimony would be crucial in establishing the pattern of deliberate targeting and systematic exploitation that characterized their approach. The FBI needed someone who could explain the psychological manipulation techniques from a victim's perspective and demonstrate how the criminals had weaponized grief and loneliness against vulnerable families. Preparing for the federal trial meant reliving the worst months of our family's experience, but it also provided an opportunity to prevent these criminals from destroying other families the way they'd tried to destroy ours. Agent Chen estimated that successful prosecution of the entire network would protect hundreds of potential future victims. Emma decided to attend the trial as a support person and witness to Dennis's manipulation tactics. Her presence during testimony about psychological abuse and financial exploitation helped demonstrate the multi-generational impact these crimes have on families. Watching a young woman explain how she'd been gaslighted into accepting surveillance and theft made the abstract concept of financial abuse feel concrete and personal. Mom's role in the trial was more complicated. She had to admit publicly that she'd enabled Dennis's crimes through her desperate need for companionship and her willingness to believe his lies about my motivations. But her testimony also provided crucial insight into the grooming process these predators use to gain control over their victims. "He studied me like homework," Mom testified. "He knew exactly what I needed to hear about being loved and protected after losing my husband. Every romantic gesture, every expensive gift, every reassurance was calculated to make me more dependent on him emotionally and financially." The defense attorneys tried to argue that the relationships were consensual and that the financial transfers were legitimate gifts from women who'd chosen to share their resources with new partners. But the evidence of forgery fraud and systematic deception across multiple victims made clear that these weren't romantic relationships, but criminal enterprises disguised as courtships. The trial lasted 3 weeks and resulted in convictions for all 7 members of the criminal network. Dennis received an additional 5 years added to his sentence for his role as a recruiter who identified potential targets and shared intelligence about family financial situations with other predators. But the most satisfying outcome was the establishment of new federal legislation inspired by our case. The Widow Protection Act required additional oversight for large financial transfers during the first 2 years after a spouse's death and created federal funding for victim services specifically designed for financial elder abuse situations. The law also mandated training for bank employees, estate attorneys, and funeral industry workers on recognizing signs of financial exploitation during the grieving process. These professionals would be required to report suspicious activity and provide resources for families who might be targeted by predators. My nonprofit organization received federal grant funding to expand our victim support services and prevention education programs. We developed materials specifically for recent widows and widowers, helping them understand common manipulation techniques and establish protective barriers against financial exploitation. Emma graduated from college with a degree in criminal justice and was accepted into a graduate program specializing in financial crimes investigation. Her personal experience with victimization had motivated her to pursue a career protecting other families from similar exploitation. But the most meaningful change was within our own family relationships. Mom had completed 18 months of therapy and was dating again, but this time with healthy boundaries and support from Emma and me throughout the process. She'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics and trust her daughter's judgment about potential partners. I understand now that love doesn't require sacrificing my family relationships or my financial security, she explained during one of our Sunday dinners. Real love would want me to maintain my other important connections, not isolate me from the people who genuinely care about my well-being. Grandmother Helen had become a powerful advocate for financial abuse prevention in her retirement community, speaking regularly about her experience with Dennis and helping other elderly residents recognize warning signs of exploitation. Her openness about being victimized had encouraged several other residents to report suspicious relationships and seek help before losing their savings. The ripple effects of our story continued expanding months after the trial concluded. Banking industry conferences invited me to speak about victim perspectives on financial crimes prevention. State legislators consulted me when drafting stronger penalties for elder abuse crimes. Social service agencies incorporated our story into training materials for caseworkers who might encounter families experiencing financial exploitation. But perhaps the most gratifying development was hearing from other families who'd used our example to find courage to report their own situations. I received letters from daughters who'd exposed fraudulent caregivers' sons, who'd reported financial abuse by family members and spouses who'd discovered their partners were stealing from elderly relatives. One letter particularly moved me from a woman whose mother had been targeted by a romance scammer very similar to Dennis. Reading about your family's experience helped me understand that protecting my mother wasn't betrayal, it was love, she wrote. I finally found the strength to report the crimes and get my mother the help she needed to recover both financially and emotionally. The second Thanksgiving after Dennis's arrest felt like a completely different holiday. Our dinner was smaller but infinitely more authentic, featuring only family members who'd chosen to be there through honest communication and mutual respect. Emma cooked several dishes using Dad's recipes. Mom contributed desserts she'd learned to make during her therapy recovery process, and I prepared the pumpkin bread that had started this entire journey. Grandmother Helen offered a toast that summarized everything we'd learned: to families built on truth instead of manipulation, love instead of exploitation, and strength instead of desperation. And to Rosa, who had the courage to protect us all when we couldn't protect ourselves. As we sat around the table sharing memories of Dad and discussing our plans for the future, I realized that losing the family we thought we had led us to discover the family we actually needed. Every person present had chosen to be there through honesty, accountability, and genuine affection, rather than obligation or manipulation. 2 years after that devastating Thanksgiving confrontation, I stood in my own apartment kitchen preparing dinner for a very different kind of family gathering. Emma was bringing her new boyfriend, Jake, a fellow criminal justice student who'd been carefully vetted through months of gradual introduction to our family story. Mom was coming with her therapist's blessing and a homemade apple pie that represented her commitment to rebuilding our relationships through consistent, trustworthy actions. Grandmother Helen arrived first, carrying a card from the 23 families who'd attended her financial abuse prevention workshop the previous week. Each family had signed a note thanking our family for sharing our story and helping them protect their own elderly relatives from similar exploitation. Her work in the retirement community had become a model program that other senior living facilities across the state were implementing. Emma and Jake arrived together, and I was struck by how different this introduction felt from Tyler's uncomfortable presence during Dennis's manipulative dinner 2 years earlier. Jake had been told our family's story gradually, with Emma explaining the lessons we'd learned about recognizing healthy versus manipulative relationship patterns. He treated our experience with respect and understanding rather than judgment. Mom entered last, carrying not just the apple pie, but also a folder containing updates on the federal victim restitution program that had grown out of Dennis's prosecution. She'd become an active volunteer helping other financial abuse victims navigate the complex legal and emotional recovery process, using her personal experience to provide guidance and support. "I have some news to share," Mom announced as we gathered around the dinner table. "The FBI contacted me last week about Dennis trying to contact me from prison through a third party. He's apparently still attempting to manipulate family members, probably hoping to convince someone to help him with early parole applications." The attempt at continued manipulation didn't surprise any of us. Detective Williams had warned that financial predators often persist in targeting their victims even after conviction and imprisonment. Dennis's refusal to accept responsibility or show genuine remorse had been consistent throughout his prosecution and sentencing. "But here's the important part," Mom continued. "I immediately reported the contact attempt to the authorities without feeling any temptation to respond or engage with his manipulation. 2 years ago, I might have wondered if he was genuinely sorry or if I should give him another chance. Now I understand that protecting myself and my family means maintaining absolute boundaries with someone who chose to exploit our trust." Emma shared updates about her graduate program and her internship with the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division. She'd been assigned to help investigate a case involving a fraudulent investment advisor who'd specifically targeted widows in small rural communities, using tactics very similar to Dennis's approach with individual families. "Working on the case has been challenging emotionally," Emma admitted, "but it's also been healing in unexpected ways. I get to use my personal experience to help protect other families, and I can see how Dennis's prosecution created legal precedents that make it easier to convict other financial predators." My nonprofit organization had expanded beyond my wildest expectations with chapters in 6 states and partnerships with major banks, legal aid societies, and elder care organizations. We'd helped over 200 families navigate financial abuse situations, providing both practical resources and emotional support for the complex recovery process. The most rewarding part has been watching families rebuild their relationships after exposing financial exploitation, I told everyone. It's incredibly difficult work, but families that go through the process honestly often end up stronger and more connected than they were before the crisis. The conversation naturally turned to Dad's memory and the lessons he'd taught us about integrity, courage, and family loyalty. Reading his letter during the crisis had provided crucial guidance, but living according to his values over the past 2 years had been the real tribute to his influence on our lives. Dad would be proud of how we've handled this situation, Emma reflected. Not just exposing Dennis's crimes, but using the experience to protect other families and strengthen our own relationships through honest communication and mutual support. Grandmother Helen agreed, adding her perspective as someone who'd known Dad since childhood. Your father always said that real family loyalty meant protecting family members from harm, even when that protection required difficult confrontations. Rosa showed exactly that kind of loyalty when she chose truth over peace. As dinner wound down, I realized how profoundly our family had been transformed by surviving Dennis's exploitation. We'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics, establish healthy boundaries, and prioritize authentic relationships over convenient ones. The painful process of exposing and recovering from financial abuse had taught us lessons about trust, communication, and resilience that would protect us for the rest of our lives. The empty chair where Dennis once sat no longer represented loss or failure. It represented liberation from manipulation and the possibility of genuine relationships built on honesty and mutual respect. Every person at our table had chosen to be there through accountability, growth, and commitment to treating family relationships as sacred rather than transactional. Mom's transformation had been the most dramatic and inspiring to witness. She'd evolved from a vulnerable widow desperate for companionship into a confident advocate who helped other victims recognize their own strength and worth. Her volunteer work with financial abuse survivors had given her purpose and healing while honoring Dad's memory through service to others. Emma had discovered her calling in criminal justice, partly through our family crisis, but also through witnessing the broader impact that individual courage can have on systemic problems. Her career would be devoted to protecting families from the kind of exploitation we'd experienced, ensuring that Dennis's crimes ultimately contributed to preventing future victimization. The federal legislation inspired by our case had already protected hundreds of families from similar schemes. Banking industry reforms had made it much more difficult for financial predators to operate undetected. Law enforcement agencies had better training and resources for investigating elder abuse crimes. Our painful experience had been transformed into protective systems that would benefit countless future victims. As I looked around the table at my family sharing honest conversation and genuine laughter, I understood that Dad's greatest gift hadn't been the inheritance money Dennis tried to steal. His greatest gift had been the example of integrity he'd modeled throughout his life and the courage he'd inspired in all of us to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. The message I'd sent from my car that Thanksgiving morning had been motivated by anger and hurt, but it had grown into something much larger and more meaningful. Speaking truth with courage had not only saved our family's financial future, but had also restored our capacity for authentic relationships built on trust, rather than manipulation. Standing in my kitchen that evening washing dishes while listening to my family's comfortable conversation in the next room, I felt the deep peace that comes from knowing you've honored your values, even in the most challenging circumstances. The empty chair at our table represented not what we'd lost, but what we'd gained the wisdom to recognize genuine love from calculated exploitation, the strength to choose difficult truth over comfortable lies, and the understanding that real family bonds are built through accountability and growth rather than blind loyalty and enabling. Dennis's attempt to destroy our family had ultimately made us stronger, more connected, and better equipped to protect others from similar exploitation. Justice had been served not just through his imprisonment and the recovery of stolen money, but through the transformation of our painful experience into resources that would help other families survive and thrive after financial abuse. The life lesson that emerged from our ordeal was profound and lasting. Family loyalty means protecting family members from harm, not enabling people who choose to inflict that harm. Speaking truth with courage, though it may temporarily destroy relationships, ultimately creates space for authentic healing and genuine connection. And sometimes the greatest act of love is exposing lies that masquerade as affection, even when that exposure requires tremendous personal strength and results in painful consequences. Our father's memory lived on not through preserved traditions or material inheritance, but through our commitment to the values he'd taught us about integrity, courage, and protecting those we love from exploitation. The blocked doorway that had seemed like rejection 2 years earlier had actually been the beginning of our liberation from manipulation and our journey toward authentic family relationships built on truth, accountability, and mutual respect. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and protecting someone you love? Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most meaningful outcomes, and speaking up for what's right can transform not just our own lives, but the lives of countless others who need to see examples of courage in action. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help it reach other families who might be facing similar challenges. Subscribe to hear more stories about finding strength in difficult situations, and share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding the warning signs of financial abuse. Thank you for listening, and remember that your voice and your choices matter more than you might realize. Here's to families built on truth, relationships founded on respect, and the courage to protect those we love, even when it requires difficult decisions.